Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Luke's at the Crossroads. Another interesting day, another interesting topic. And I'd like to introduce our panel members for the day. Good morning, Betty Lukes.
Oh, good morning, Arnie.
And Wallace Klinck from Canada. Welcome, Wallace.
Good evening. Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful day here in Alberta. Beautiful clouds sailing across the sky and streaky clouds and cumulus clouds. It's just an absolute beautiful picture of nature.
Excellent. That's wonderful news, Wally. We've got a lovely winter's day in Adelaide, and it's a bit fresh. We've had the fire going, but I must admit you cranked the fire up, and it's quite cosy at home. All right. Now we're talking about many things. The other day we talked about the Canon of Rightness, and of course our website is called Douglas Social Credit: The Policy of Freedom. So the rightness and freedom, they go hand in hand. Inherently within us, we wish to be free. We don't want to be oppressed. We don't want the tyrant lording it over us, but rather we want, it's inherent within us to want to express ourselves, to be creative. As our Heavenly Father created us, so we want to be creative. It's actually an outworking of our expression of humanity, created in His image. What a wonderful thing to consider that. Okay, well, I'll pass the floor on to Betty. Welcome, Betty.
Arnie, thank you. Well, this morning I'd like to reiterate, go back over some of the things that we've spoken about in this Canon of Rightness, and remind ourselves that, as an example, that the Ten Commandments are a moral code. They're the arbitrary code of behavior for human beings, and but there is a universal moral code, and it deals with the nature of man. By behaving in conformity with his nature, man enjoys his true freedom. The Christian Church called this nature the natural law of humanity, and this natural law of humanity is discoverable, like any other law of nature, by experience. And I was reminded of this fact over the years when Eric Butler was alive and he came to Adelaide. Then I would take him to meetings where he was the speaker, and Eric didn't mind a good discussion, a good controversial discussion. And so it was not unusual for people within the audience, especially men, that they would sneer at much of what he said. But he used to point out that this natural law of harmony, while we didn't see the effects of it immediately, in time it worked through. And of course that is the understanding I have of when we talk about the mills of God, that they grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly small. And we just have to look at the world around us, and I think, what chaos, what disorder, what a mess. Where has man got, what sort of a mess has man got himself into? And I think it's just amazing that C.H. Douglas, along with such historians as Hilaire Belloc, saw that this Christian civilization was in trouble 100 years ago, because of course they understood this natural law of humanity. Both men saw the organic structure had ossified, it had grown old, and it hadn't been renewed, of course. How is the regeneration to take place? And remember, Belloc saw that Christianity was in trouble even before the Reformation. And remember, the Christian prototype of a society is laid down in the teaching of the Trinity. You will find the structure of metaphysical reality within the Trinity. And Australia's parliaments are based on that Trinitarian reality, of course, today they're just an empty shell. But because men have, as Solzhenitsyn said, men have forgotten God. And but federal parliament and state parliament and even local councils were based on the Trinitarian concept, and power was separated and divided. And that to me is most important. And I think about Jordan Peterson and his promotion of the pyramidal structure, and his popularity. He's done a lot of good for young men. I can see that, but he does not understand about the Trinitarian nature of reality, or if he does, he certainly hasn't got to it yet. I've been waiting to hear what he has to say about the New Testament, but as so far, I haven't seen anything. But this to me is where I think that we should be heading.
Thank you, Betty. That's a very good opening salvo about the things that we have forgotten, which ought not to have been forgotten but are now lost. But we're finding it again. Wally Klinck.
Well, C.H. Douglas, who founded Social Credit, is of course known, maybe perhaps certainly amongst people who are not social creditors, as someone who just put forth a theory of financial mechanism and policy. But actually, Douglas, as an engineer, had a very, very deep, a very intensive experience of relating to things and to forces and energy. And when he developed his theory of a deficiency of purchasing power, or that the price system is not self-liquidating, capable of canceling its own costs, he realized that there was a much bigger issue involved, and that is association as such, not just in the physical realm, but association in the psychological and the emotional and so on. In other words, in the area of human relationships. And of course, we're today touching on the canon, which presumably is the law that presides over the universe. And unless you believe in chaos theory, where everything is just fortuitous and nothing ever makes sense, when you think about anything you do in life, it tends to be purposive. It's not just that you run around helter-skelter doing things with no rational purpose. So that when we do carry on with various projects or activities, we have a purpose, and it's purposive. It's not chaotic. I think this chaos theory is a very dangerous theory, because it seems to degrade one's faith in the nature of things, and also it would tend, I think, to weaken our ability to defend ourselves against tyrannical powers. So in any case, I think that that's very important to remember. And the canon, I mean, it refers to something that governs the entire universe. It is something that simply is, and it is all pervasive and all relevant. And if we have free will, if we have the ability to contravene the canon, we are then able to lead ourselves off into a futile, sterile pattern where we don't relate to reality. And if we don't relate to reality, I don't think there's any possibility in the world of us having any kind of a meaningful and successful existence.
Thank you, Wally. It's beautifully put. Relating to reality, I've worked as a builder in my spare time most of my life. My family are builders, and we come from a family of builders before them. And both my brothers were principal builders. And in the construction of a home, you can't even begin to consider building a home until you take into account the environment that you want to establish a home in, and the facilities that are there, the lay of the land. And of course, if you're thinking ahead, you also consider the direction of the sun. and whether the slope falls one way or the other, and how your drainage is going to work, and how your roof drainage is going to work, and your sewer. And there are all these things to take into account. You're observing the natural world. And so, on the basis of that, then before you even put the first shovel in the ground, you've taken all these considerations. And so it should be that when we're looking at how people should function in a society, in a community. Now, the people who designed our constitution took into account how things are, how things actually work. Common law was established based on how things actually could work. How could people actually get on? And so the laws actually evolved over hundreds of years and hundreds of different cases, so that it became an acceptable outcome, consequence that the community could live with. All these things are observing how things work. And you can't arbitrarily come up with a new mode or a new fashion of this. Well, it ought to work this way. Well, I'm sorry, but it ought to. You don't build houses upside down because they ought to be upside down. You build houses in a certain way because that's how it actually functions. And the fact is that if you like, the bureaucrat conceives things in their mind. It ought to work. And therefore, because I've got the power, I'm going to impose it. And of course, ultimately, this is the philosophy. This is what they inherently believe. The bureaucrat in charge, the totalitarian, is the ultimate planner. And that, of course, doesn't take into account the nature of how people are. Betty Lukes.
Yes, thank you, Arnie. In listening to you, I'm reminded of the headline that I saw the other day that young people, obviously because they don't see that socialism or what passes for capitalism is working, are now turning to socialism. And but the article did point out he wondered whether these young people had ever heard of Mao Zedong or Stalin or Lenin and what happened in the Soviet Union or in communist China. Obviously not. But that brought me back to thinking of Jeffrey Dobbs. Jeffrey Dobbs was, and I thank you, Wally, because you picked me up on that very graciously, that Jeffrey Dobbs was a botanist and not a biologist. His speciality was fungi. But he wrote of the Trinitarian realities that are built into our thinking, and we just take them for granted. And he listed space, time, and matter. Space has 3 dimensions, height, depth, and width. Time has the past, present, and the future. And science wouldn't have got off the ground if they hadn't have thought in the terms of this Trinitarian reality. And when it comes to human affairs, well, of course, the father, the mother, and child. There's no continuity of life without the child. In world affairs, whenever a trinity breaks down or becomes unbalanced, then you end up with a monopoly or a duality. And of course, that reminded me of Jordan Peterson and his pyramid of power. And conflicts take place among those struggling to reach the apex of power. And our system was not built on that concept. It was taken from the Christian concept. And it was that human beings were in association, and they had to work out their relationships and the society and the systems, all of that in relation to that association. The nature of the Trinity was first revealed to man in the New Testament by the Incarnation. And after this revelation, the Trinitarian structure of the universe gradually became apparent. And the Trinity was the key, the door to understanding by science.
Thank you for that, Betty. I'm actually just wandering around through a few web pages, and I'm going to bring them up because they're very important. This one here is, we talked about the nature of things. This is Christine Jones' Amazing Carbon, and this is an illustration of the mycorrhizal fungi that surround a plant root. And the plant root is just not there on its own in isolation, but it is in a community of fungi, in a community. And this is absolutely beautiful. And I'll also bring up this other point here, and this is about the microbiota, the organisms within our own colon. It is a community of organisms, a community of fungi, if you like, or bugs in our colon. We do not operate alone as a standalone unit, but we operate in community, and we need to take into account the effect that we actually have on the community within the soil and within our own body. We just can't limit our thinking to just say, well, it's me and I'm good for this. It doesn't work that way. This is how you make yourself ill. This is how you actually deplete the life forces in the soil. Both the same. We come from the soil. From the dust you shall return. That's Ash Wednesday. Wally Klinck.
Well, I guess what you're saying is that if we tend to regard everything as discrete rather than as interrelated, we can become unbalanced. Is that what you're saying, Arnie? I believe.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. By the way, Betty, with regard to Jeffrey Dobbs, he was a plant biologist, which is a botanist, so you weren't completely wrong. Anyway, yes, these people who are looking toward an answer to problems, and believe me, there are problems, because when we talk about capitalism, it is not a free association of economically engaged people. There are a lot of problems with it. It's primarily, as Douglas said, the distributive aspect of it, which is very, very faulted and causes a lot of the problems and grief in society that young people identify rightly or wrongly, and in many cases quite rightly, when you view their increasingly burdensome student debts and things like that. But, when you think of socialism, socialism is, in its proper sense, or full sense, formal sense, it is the collective ownership and administration of the means of production. And if you start to think about that, actually what they're asking for is they're asking for the ultimate absolute capitalism, monopoly capitalism, where all capital is controlled by the state. And of course, we all know, if we're even slightly realistic, that any organization is always largely run by some individual or individuals. And so that the state is not just some kind of an amorphous, directionless, automatically moral and ethical organism. It is something that is run by human beings. And if you give human beings excess power, it will corrupt them. It will corrupt their attitude toward their fellow man, and it will corrupt their sense of realism because they become carried away with the sense of power. And in order to properly utilize the things with which we have been given, we have to have humility. We have to have humility, which means a genuine respect for truth, for actuality, and the ability to actually seek it, effectively. And that does take humility, because the first thing you have to admit is that you might not be right the first time around. So you have to keep searching for a better way. And Douglas did say that that which works best is that which is moral. Now, I realize that the term best probably needs definition, but there can be no doubt that what he meant by best was the happiness and satisfaction and health and well-being, the weal of society.
Thank you, Wally. That's beautifully put. And of course, it goes to illustrate the profound thinking that Douglas took on when he presented the compelling case for social credit. Betty Lukes.
That's exactly right. That's the importance of that balance of powers in human affairs. It is clear, Jeffrey Dobbs said this, it is clear it is the outcome in practice of thinking which carries the consequences of both life and death. What do we see around us today but chaos and disorder? And it made me think about going back to the Bible on this, because I am wanting to introduce the work of McGilchrist and Tweedy and what they understood that the poet William Blake was all about, then I thought I'd better make sure that I was heading in the right direction. And these are just some wise sayings that come from the Bible. Death and life in power of the tongue. In other words, there's death and life in the power of the tongue. And as a man thinketh, so is he. In 1 Peter 3:10, it says, the love of life and good days, the man must keep his tongue from evil and lips speaking deceit. And that reminded me that another interpretation of social credit by a minister of religion, and it's in the fig tree, but I don't remember where. And he pointed out that it could also be understood as faithful dealings. And this is what we're trying to do, to show you that there must be faithful dealings amongst man and man. And what did I read in the news today? That the wife of the Netanyahu of Israel has just been charged with fraud. We have the case here in Australia of a new senator who had to pay back money that she had taken from the public, you could say, to pay for the airfare for two of her relatives to help her celebrate her 50th birthday. I can't believe it. They think that the public funds are just there for their taking. So we have to rethink all of our thoughts that I can see and come back to some fundamentals, and that's what we're endeavouring to do on this forum.
Thank you, Betty, for that. I'm going to cut across to our website here, which is Book Depository, and just show you the Roderick Tweedy, The God of the Left Hemisphere, Blake, Bolt, Taylor and the Myth of Creation, and also Ian McGilchrist, The Master and His Emissary. These are both very lengthy works on the left and right hemisphere of the brain and how they actually work, and it's most profound when you realise that if you like, the autocrat, the bureaucrat, the totalitarian concentrates their thinking in the left hemisphere, and it's the right hemisphere that actually allows a person to take into account the world around them and the influence that they have and the influence that the world has on them, their mutualism, their interrelatedness. These are all part of the right hemisphere and most profound. And it's wonderful reading the scholarly work of these two people. Wally Klinck.
Well, that's right. We don't just manipulate things. We have to think about the reasons we're manipulating and the purposes to which they can be put and whether they're going to be good or bad purposes. And it's very important that we have a capacity to evaluate in that sense. And if we're just concerned with things as discrete objects or figures or whatever, we are going to fall deficient in our philosophy of life, our idea of what life is really intended to be or what it is about. And so it's very, very important. And as you say, the ability to sway human consciousness to the functions of one side of the brain as opposed to the other can certainly disarm people in the area of values and abstract things, because they will not be practiced or skilled or educated in that particular area. So people become then much more subject to control because they just don't have the defenses. And that, of course, is what propaganda is largely all about. And, of course, the Marxists are quite skilled in that. They have a considerable understanding of human psychology and how to manipulate it. And we, in our particular school of social credit, believe that the individual is of primary importance, that you build up from the individual and not down from the state. And so this is, from our perspective, this is an extremely dangerous thing. And you can see that it has been quite successful in infiltrating our institutions of learning, high learning at first, going down gradually into the high schools and even into the lower grades. And it is really important for our survival that we learn something about these techniques, because if we don't, we're going to be more and more manipulated in the wrong direction, in the direction that makes us subject to external authority. Douglas spoke about immanent sovereignty, in other words, the freedom of the individual to act. Now, obviously, there have to be some restraints, because if the individual has the wrong orientation, intent, or objective, and acts in a way to limit other people's freedom in the same way, then there has to be some attention to proper restraint. But that is not an insurmountable issue, and I think it is fairly clear. So.
Thank you, Wally, for that. I'm reminded of a few campaigns that the Marxists are using to brutalise people. This Safe Schools campaign. To me, what they're doing is they're sexualising young children when they're not at all ready for any orientation towards sexuality or any other sexual understanding whatsoever. And they're bringing it to the forefront of their thinking prematurely. And I see that as abhorrent, that they would damage our children by exposing them to this so early. And then, of course, you've got the sexuality campaign. If that's not brutalising, I don't know what is. You can't speak, you can't think, you can't say, because you're going to offend someone, or someone's going to get upset. I mean, this is brutality. This is state-sanctioned brutality, and that, to me, we're being Bolshevised by this thinking. Betty Lukes.
Well, Arnie, this goes back a long way. I was looking again at a book that I have put out by the Aquinas Society, Christian Philosophy in the Common Law. And there was a time after the Reformation that it is said in the book here that history was manufactured and, of course, changed. And the writer points out that, and by the way, the writer is Richard O'Sullivan, KC, and that was written while King George VI was on the throne. But he says this: Blakestone's picture of a nation divided into two parties, the bishops and clergy on the one side, contending for their foreign jurisprudence, the nobility and laity on the other side adhering with equal pertinacity to the old common law, is not true. And that, to me, is evidence of already the division, bringing division within the nation. And that would have been into the law, and that, to me, is part of the dialectics. And that's what we have to understand and think in other terms.
Thank you, Betty. I'm looking at the clock. We're just on the 29-minute mark, and I can see that how important this forum is as we discuss the Canon of Rightness, pursuing the Canon of Rightness, which is our objective. And of course, I would encourage not only our listeners to watch and listen to what we're talking about, but actually to establish their own forums and discuss these things. If they can't get out and have community meetings, at least get on a teleconference. Skype is there, or Wirecast, or Zoom, or whatever, and you've got the software, and you can have these discussions on a daily basis and start getting your thinking more clearly on this very vital issue. Okay, closing comments, Wally.
Well, yes, the only way to do something is to do it right. And that requires discipline. It requires the ability to relate what you're doing to certain principles which are inherent in the universe, not just fate principles, utopian principles, which are just a product of someone's imagination. As Douglas said, the utopian is the most dangerous individual to society because he has a conception, some kind of an ideal in his own mind, and he wants to impose that on the rest of society. And that is not an organic approach to life. It is an imposed concept. The organic approach is you meet life, you have experiences, and you learn from it. And so that is a very, very important thing. And I think that, well, an example, we just had an example here where there had been scheduled formally, I think it was at the Ottawa Library in Canada here, an address. And on the last day before the event, of course, the sponsors are notified that it's been canceled because they don't really agree with the content of it. Now, it's not their, that's confusing function and authority. I mean, they are a public institution, and it is financed by public monies, and they do not have the rightful, legitimate power to make edicts like that, unless there's something going on that is clearly illegal or advocating some kind of outright violence. But I mean, this is a question of discussion of policy, political policy, and so on. And I mean, that's something that people have to be able to discuss in a free society, so that some people have just completely, they're out of control. They're completely out of control. They don't know what their proper function is, and they don't know what their proper limitations are. And you can pretty well imagine where that leads.
Thank you, Wally. That's a very good illustration of the fascist in charge, whether they're socialist or fascism or Nazi or communist or anything in between. Anyone who's a totalitarian. My view counts, no one else's does, and I will suppress that point of view. And of course, that's impertinence because no one is endowed with such profound knowledge that they know everything. There's always another point of view, as I attempted to illustrate with the microbiome and the soil fungi. These are relatively new sciences. While people may have known a little bit about them, they haven't gone into them so profoundly deep that they understand the ins and outs. And of course, this science, this knowledge, is constantly being revealed, and it's up to us to pursue it and try and harness our understanding so that it fits in with what actually does occur. Closing comments, Betty Lux.
Well, I guess we can expect to see the power monger wield his power over us, but that's not how we're going to solve problems. And it looks to me we might end up like the Soviet system. We'll see what happens. But I remind our viewers that the Christian concept is of mutual love and cooperation between individuals, and the power divided and separated of politics.
Thank you for that, Betty. That's beautifully put. And I'm reminded of the Athanasian Creed in that it speaks of the Trinity in unity. The Godhead is not one power over the other as a monotheistic or dialectical materialism, as a dualism. It's mutualism, and it's each has a function. And in this illustration, what we're seeing, at least today, what we're seeing is that the church is silent. And it's been silent for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, it's complicit. And what it should be is a balance between the state, the church, and the people. And the church should speak on moral and ethical issues and stand up in the forefront. And what is moral? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but unto God what is God's. And you can't render unto God unless you're free. And that's where it comes into it. So, interesting discussion. Thank you for that. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, will come a waltzing Matilda with me.